is going to be a part 5 of this subject. Here we go. Waptek, you need to become educated. 110 stories tall building, only 30 to 40 feet of rubble left. Suppose you got the math to figure that out. Okay. In a building with an average day of 50,000 workers, 430 companies, and 140,000 visitors, the World Trade Center buildings were built to sustain and tolerate wind load rather than gravity load primarily as the domination of the design, because it was considered more of an issue to solve. And again, the assertion that it could tolerate being hit by an airplane, I don't care about, because it was assumed at the time that the airplane hitting it would be under 100 miles an hour, not 500. But let's actually talk about this. Now, one of the things that keeps getting brought up is the construction materials and that sort of thing, and the dimensions, and it all fell into the footprint when it did not. But we're going to do devil's advocate and assume the entire footprint of the building collapsed down. What would happen? Because the assertion that people keep making that doesn't make any sense is that there were silenced explosives used to bring down the Twin Towers for some reason. So here we go. The buildings were 500 tons or 500,000 tons or 450 million kilograms each. They had 90 million kilograms or 100 tons of steel, and this comprised the Vierendeel trusses, which went from point A to point B between the metal pieces, metal decking, and 240 vertical steel columns on the outside here that had a thickness that varied from 4 inches or 10 centimeters at the base to 4 inch, quarter inch, or 7 millimeters at the top. This is the thickness of the metal that comprised them. The box shape they took up is dead airspace. There's no reason to put up a steel bar this big when you can just make a really big space with about the same amount of metal and spread it out more. This was all protected with sprayed on fire resistant material. It wasn't cement encased or anything like that. Some of the columns on the core should be considered that way, but let's talk about what actually was there for cement. This all was made to hold up 160,000 cubic meters or 212.5 thousand cubic yards of lightweight concrete. That's the estimate that's given by how much concrete was poured. So anyway, what is that and how thick is that all? Well, it's 110 floors is the claim. It's actually a specific different number depending on whether you count all the floors underground and above ground and occupiable space. People like quoting different numbers depending on what they're trying to push. But let's go with 110 stories like this person did. Okay? The lightweight concrete was poured primarily for the slab floors. How thick were they? 4 inches. How wide? Doesn't really matter, but it's 208 by 208 on average. But hey, that's 4 inches. You take 3 floors, that's a foot thick of material just from there. This is the suspended material. I'm not including the metal trusses, which were really skinny metal cage type things. You can look up how they were built. And we're not going to estimate the volume of metal here. We're just going to do the cement because it is cement. So it's 4 inch thick floors, 110 of them. That gives you 36 feet of depth of the cement. I'm not including the decking, corrugated metal, or the Vierendeel trusses. But let's go with that. They would have needed, when they were poured, 534 cubic yards of cement. Now, wet cement at the time would have been 100,000 million, a million pounds or 800,000 kilograms, etc. per floor or something like that. Okay, let's go. this is based on running a calculator for how much it would weigh when it's poured. When it's dried, it's a different mass. You have to look up the differences. And this is a variety of cement that weighed as little as possible for the maximum strength, holding capacity, and distribution of weight and stuff. And reinforcement was primarily done by the metal cladding material underneath. And I'm assuming it's steel. It could have been any metal, but we'll assume it's steel. To get a collapsed down stack for the floor's minimum height, you divide the number of floors by 3, because they're 4-inch slabs. That would give you the number of feet. You get 36 feet. That's minimum height. Okay, but the person's assertion is it's 30 to 40 feet of rubble left on top. The bathtub underground foundation space was at minimum, actually was not minimum. This is by looking at a picture of the damn thing while they were building the entire building in the bathtub, was underground 65 feet or 6 floors or something like that. We're going to say it's 60 feet. So 60 feet plus, let's say 30 feet conservative height of the pile of garbage on top as the building had collapsed. That's almost 100 feet of material compacted into the basement and visible above ground for jumble factor and collapse. The buildings, when you see it, the top section essentially pile drives all the other layers down. And no, it doesn't move at free fall speed. Please stop doing that. So anyway, there are 2 voids in New York that are 75% of the original footprint size. They do not define the original footprint's depth or width when you look at the reflecting pools. Now, the impact of all of this is, you can use seismometers or whatever as a joke, but the actual impact of all of these things is what I'm going to be talking about next. And I'm going to repeat this. Why are you assuming that a 30 or 40 foot tall pile of rubble from a building that also went underground, if you count the 110 stories, this is the underground stories, you get 65 feet of depth underground. It's over 6 floors. At that point, 65 feet, 30, 40 feet, that's 100 feet almost of if you decide the 40 foot tall max. That's around 100, or let's say 80 to 100 feet of material. And a lot of it fell outside of the footprint. So now you're going to claim that's too much material? Yeah, the cores were, well, everybody imagines the cores of these buildings being giant masses of cement that were used to stabilize it, which is an interesting idea. But the thing is, that's not actually what is stated about them anywhere. The idea was to make the building as lightweight as possible to where you could build it as tall as possible, because the designer was told you have to find a way to do this so it has a certain amount of surface area. So he made an open tube and tube design plan. (2,823) people were killed on 9/11. 125 were in the Pentagon by 19 Al-Qaeda hijackers of 4 airplanes. 15 of them were from Saudi Arabia. Underground fires continue burning for 39 days, so there was some airspace. The maximum heat detected at any of the fires, whether above or below ground, was listed at 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. And instead of acknowledging that, yeah, that might not melt steel, but that would definitely weaken it, then people say, well, it must be ray beams or radiation or nukes or anything. It's like, no, the building's caught on fire for hours and hours, and it was a blowtorch effect. Ground Zero workers searched for 230 days through 1 million tons of debris, looking for remains of personal effects. And I'm going to list what they found, but that 1 million pounds is the 2 500,000 pound or 500,000 ton, each building. They found 65,000 items, 2 to the 16th power. 437 watches, 144 wedding rings, and almost 20,000 body parts. They found 291 intact bodies at one point, is the report. The New York Medical Examiner identified directly 1,100 people. 1,600 death certificates were issued without a body at request of victims' families because it was needed, because they were simply missing. They needed to be declared dead because out of 64,000 items and 20,000 body parts. We still don't know everything about what was and what wasn't happening. 105 were still classified as missing with no evidence for them, but the rest were technically found. There were no survivors of the impact of the planes or impacts to the buildings hitting the ground found at ground zero. This left 1,300 orphans and 422,000 New Yorkers diagnosed with PTSD from dealing with this. Collectively, the entire city took an emotional hit. 10,000 of those were school students. 237,000 jobs were lost in the U.S. travel industry over the next 5 months. 100,000 jobs were lost just in Lower Manhattan. 5,000 displaced workers received job referrals out of that bunch by the time that number was being quoted. And $21 billion in property losses and insurance costs occurred to everybody involved. But people talk about 21 billion or 21 trillion, exact number by the way, missing that people keep screaming is unaccounted for, when you can actually find out that the money wasn't accounted for because they didn't keep track of it, that's all. After this, because of the airplanes not flying because they were shut down, the days were a little warmer and the nights were a little cooler for September. Sort of like clouds shielding the earth from the sun during the day and trapping heat during the night. And this not happening made it to where the slight increase in clouds caused by airplanes was actually noted. Hundreds of memorials and dedications, flagpoles, crucifixes, and artworks have been made using steel from Ground Zero to commemorate it. At the same time, being Americans, 150 songs were banned for being lyrically questionable or triggering afterwards. The top searches in that week after 9/11 were as follows, according to one or two of the listings. Nostradamus came up first. CNN second to Nostradamus. Then actually look up the World Trade Center. And then fourth, Osama bin Laden being looked up. Nostradamus. So, I'm sure that we've improved since then, right? So to repeat, 110 stories compacting down into a 60-foot, we'll just say something under 60-foot basement area of floors, 6 floors or something like that, depending on which building you're looking at. Leaving a layer of 30 to 40 feet of rubble on top on an area that did not just take up just the foundation. It doesn't seem too small at all for a building that used 4-inch thick cement slabs for all the floors and was mostly empty airspace. There's a rather nice picture that you can look up that shows light through the building as it's being built. People say, well, that was only at the beginning stages. That's what it looked like. That's how much mass it was. It was meant to be very, very light and very strong, using truss designs. Several buildings are built like that. They're just as vulnerable. A soda can, you can stand on an empty soda can, but if you damage the outside, if it isn't perfect, it has a tendency of collapsing if it has more than a certain amount of weight. Sort of like these fucked up arguments. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.